The first thing I noticed, before I even opened my eyes, was that my pillow smelled like fabric softener instead of hospital-grade antiseptic. That was wrong. Deeply, cosmically wrong. I had fallen asleep, no, I had died, in a snowbank at 11,000 feet with a compound fracture and a fiancé who hadn't so much as looked back. There should not have been a pillow. There should not have been a smell. There should not have been the tinny, cheerful buzz of an alarm clock playing a pop song I hadn't heard in exactly 1 year. I opened my eyes. Popcorn ceiling. A water stain shaped vaguely like Florida. My old apartment in Jackson, Wyoming. The one I'd given up 11 months ago when Grant convinced me it made more sense to move in with him. For the commute, babe, and also I love you, which in retrospect were two statements with wildly different truth values. I sat up so fast I nearly gave myself whiplash, grabbed my phone off the nightstand, and stared at the date like it owed me money. Friday, February 14th. I did the math out loud, slowly, the way you'd explain a diagnosis to a frightened patient. Valentine's Day fell on a Friday. The Ridgeline Outfitters Executive Wellness Summit, corporate speak for a mandatory group hike disguised as a team-building retreat so the CEO could post about work-life balance on LinkedIn. Started Saturday morning at the lodge, an hour and a half up into the Tetons. We'd drive up tomorrow afternoon. We'd sleep one night at the lodge. And on Sunday morning at 8:52, a slope 38 degrees steep and freshly wind-loaded, was going to let go under two men who'd wandered off the marked trail to be alone together. That gave me a day and a half. 1 day and a half to plan a con I'd only ever run, in my previous life, on nurses who tried to tell me they were fine when their blood pressure said otherwise. I sat very still in my old bed, in my old apartment, in a life I had apparently been issued a refund on, and did the only reasonable thing a 26-year-old emergency room nurse could do after being reborn 13 months into his own past. I laughed, not the polite kind. The kind that comes out sounding slightly deranged, the kind my coworkers at St. John's Health used to give me a wide berth for after a bad code. I laughed until my ribs hurt, because apparently the universe's idea of a second chance was handing me back the exact week my fiancé's affair went from emotionally inappropriate texting to let's disappear together on a mountain, but only accidentally, and only if nobody notices we snuck off to a different trail. Okay, I said out loud, to nobody, to the water stain shaped like Florida. Okay, cool, great, love that for me. Here is what I remembered, with the horrible clarity of a man who had spent his last conscious hour bleeding into a snowbank, with nothing to do but replay his own stupidity. Grant Whitfield, my fiancé of 2 years, golden retriever smile, mid-level product manager at Ridgeline Outfitters, had been sleeping with Kyle Bennett from marketing for at least 4 months. I hadn't known. I'd been too busy working double shifts to notice that my fiancé had started training for a half marathon on a treadmill that, when I checked the app later, after, obviously, when it no longer mattered, had approximately 11 miles logged on it total. The retreat had been Grant's idea. A whole weekend in the Tetons, just the team, very bonding. You should come. You never take time off. I'd taken time off. I'd driven up with him, and I remembered, with a clarity that still stung, standing beside the rental SUV in that gravel parking lot the first time around, arguing with him about why I always had to make things about work. The second I mentioned checking my phone for a callback shift, as if answering my job's texts were the character flaw in that relationship, and not the man currently timing his own affair around a company retreat. On the second morning, when the guides announced the trail had been flagged for elevated avalanche risk and anyone uncomfortable should absolutely sit this one out, no judgment, Grant had looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're not really an outdoors person anyway, are you, babe?" I was an ER nurse. I had literally stitched a man's scalp back together after a bar fight 2 days before that trip. I was plenty outdoors. I'd gone on the hike to prove a point. Kyle Bennett had gone on the hike because, it turned out, he and Grant had arranged to get separated from the group at the exact scenic overlook where the slope angle sat at a lovely, deadly 38 degrees. I remembered the sound before I remembered the snow, a crack like the sky breaking, then white and cold, and the specific unglamorous panic of realizing you cannot tell which direction is up. I remembered digging myself half out with hands I couldn't feel, seeing 2 sets of footprints leading off the marked trail toward the overlook, and thinking, with the eerie calm of a person whose brain has already decided to check out, oh, that's where he really was going. I remembered a second slide, smaller, minutes later, the kind that wouldn't have made the news on its own. I remembered it didn't matter, because by then a support beam of packed ice had already done what it did to my leg, and I remembered lying there long enough to understand, with total professional clarity, exactly how much time I had left and exactly why nobody was coming. And now I was in my bed, in my apartment. 13 months younger, 30 pounds lighter in the specific way that only matters if you know what an ICU diet does to a person, and holding a phone that said I had 11 texts from Grant, all sent in the last 40 minutes, all some variation of you up? Excited for tomorrow. I stared at the little mountain emoji for a long time. Then I texted back, can't wait, because if there is one thing 4 years of triage nursing teaches you, it's this: never tip off the patient that you already know how the disease progresses. You just start planning the treatment. Before we get to the part where I fake an ankle injury in front of 40 coworkers, go ahead and hit follow. This one has a lot of twists coming, and you don't want to lose your place halfway up the mountain. Here is a fact about me that will become relevant shortly. I am by nature a lazy man. Not lazy in the ways that cost anyone else anything. I will run a code blue at 3 a.m. on 4 hours of sleep and not blink, but lazy in every category that doesn't have a patient attached to it. I had let dishes sit in Grant's sink for 4 days once, out of pure principle, to see how long it would take him to notice. He never did. I had also, on 3 separate occasions, ordered delivery specifically so I wouldn't have to walk the 12 feet to my own kitchen. I mention this because the plan I built over that one frantic day and a half required more effort than I had voluntarily expended on anything in months, and I wanted on the record that the only reason I found the energy was that the alternative was watching 39 other people, plus one increasingly hateable fiancé, walk into a mountain a second time. The Ridgeline Outfitters retreat was held at a lodge outside Jackson Hole that the company had rented for the weekend. Cedar shingles, a wrap-around porch, a wall of windows facing the Tetons like the mountains, were a piece of corporate art someone had paid too much for. I recognized the gravel lot the second our car pulled in, recognized the exact stretch of it where, in another life, I'd stood arguing with Grant about phones and priorities. This time, I got out of the car first, stretched loudly and theatrically like a man limbering up for a very important performance, and said nothing at all about my phone. "You good?" Grant asked, coming around with our bags. 2 years of watching that face, square jaw, easy smile, the kind of handsome that photographs well and means nothing, and it was strange how little it did to me now, like looking at a knife you already know is dull. "Great," I said. "Never better." The plan was simple, because good plans usually are, and because I did not have the stamina for a complicated one. I was not going to accuse Grant of anything. I had no proof that would survive an argument, just a future I could no longer prove I remembered. I was not going to make a scene, not going to sense something's off, not going to do any of the things that would let him get ahead of me and clean up his story before Sunday. I was going to do what any smart nurse does when she can see a bad outcome coming from a mile away and doesn't yet have the authority to stop the whole procedure. I was going to remove myself from the equation, cleanly, believably, with witnesses. And then I was going to let gravity, physics, and other people's bad decisions do the rest of the work, because, see above, I am lazy, and the laziest possible version of justice is the kind where the mountain does your job for you. That night, the lodge served a rehearsal dinner of sorts. 40 Ridgeline employees in fleece vests, drinking overpriced hot toddies around a stone fireplace the size of a garage door, while somebody's Bluetooth speaker played acoustic covers of songs that used to have drums. I ate. I laughed at a joke from someone in accounting. I watched Grant's eyes track Kyle Bennett across the room exactly twice, both times for slightly too long, both times followed by Grant looking back at me with the overcorrected warmth of a man covering a tell he didn't know he had. And at approximately 9:40 p.m., on my way back from the bathroom, down a hallway with exactly one uneven flagstone step, I remembered it vividly, because I'd once watched a woman named Carol from HR nearly eat it on that exact step at a previous company retreat, and had made a mental note to complain to facilities that I characteristically never followed through on. I let my ankle roll. I want to be clear, it did not roll. I am an ER nurse with 4 years of experience assessing exactly what a grade 2 lateral ankle sprain looks like from the outside, and I performed one flawlessly. The half buckle, the sharp inhale, the controlled collapse against the wall rather than the floor. Collapsing on the floor looks fake. Collapsing against a wall looks like a body protecting itself. I even remembered to over-rotate my foot slightly outward on the way down, the exact mechanism of injury a real sprain would show. Honestly, it was some of the best work I've ever done for zero pay and zero acknowledgement, which again tracks. Oh my God, Daniel! That was Priya, from Ridgeline's events team, first on the scene, which was perfect, because Priya was thorough and loud and would tell absolutely everyone. Within 4 minutes I had 6 people around me, an ice pack sourced from the bar, and Grant kneeling in front of me with an expression that was, and I want to note this clinically, the way I'd chart a patient's affect, concerned, but not panicked. 2 years ago I would have found that reassuring. Now I filed it away as data. Somewhere in the small crowd, someone from accounting was already narrating the incident to a coworker who hadn't seen it happen. He just went down. It was so fast. With the breathless authority of a man who had personally witnessed something far more dramatic than a nurse executing a controlled fall against drywall. I made a mental note to thank him later sincerely for doing half my publicity work for me. "Does it need a hospital?" someone asked. "No," I said, wincing with what I felt was Oscar-worthy restraint. "No, I know how to tape it, I just need to stay off it. I'll be so mad if I miss the sunrise hike tomorrow, though." I let my voice catch, just slightly, on hike, like a man mourning an outdoor activity, and not, in fact, a man who had personally watched half this room get swallowed by a mountain in a version of tomorrow that technically hadn't happened yet. "You should absolutely not hike on that," said a voice I didn't recognize. I looked up. He was crouched on the other side of me, opposite Grant, and I noticed this before I noticed anything else about him, because it is the single most diagnostic thing you can notice about a stranger. Very gentle hands. He'd already picked up my ankle without asking, was pressing along the bone with 2 fingers in a pattern that was, disconcertingly, almost correct. "Anterior talofibular," he said, more to himself than to me, still pressing. "Does this hurt?" It did not, obviously, because there was nothing wrong with my ankle. I made a face like it did. "Yeah, a lot. Okay. Don't weight bear on it tonight." He looked up, and I finally got a proper look at him. Dark hair, a jaw that could have cut the cheese plate, wearing a flannel shirt that had clearly never once been worn to actually chop wood, and an expression of quiet, competent authority that made 3 separate Ridgeline employees instinctively lean back to give him room to work. Late 20s, maybe 30. Not corporate handsome like Grant. Something more like, if this cabin caught fire, this is the man who would carry you out of it and apologize for jostling you. "You a doctor?" I asked. "No," a small, almost private smile. "Just paranoid about ankles." Weston's part of the safety consulting team for the retreat. Priya supplied helpfully, which told me nothing and everything at once, in the way that corporate titles designed by committee always do. "Daniel," I said, and stuck out a hand like an idiot, because apparently even reborn with the tactical memory of my own death, I was still capable of forgetting basic social choreography when a good-looking stranger held my foot with 2 fingers, like it was something worth being careful with. He shook it. His grip was steady, unhurried, the kind of handshake that isn't trying to prove anything, which, after 2 years of Grant's networking event death grip, landed on me like a small, unexpected kindness. "Weston," he said. "Everyone calls me West." Somewhere in the back of my head, the old triage instinct that had kept me alive through 4 years of night shifts quietly filed him under notice this one again. Not because he was handsome, though he was, in the unbothered way of a man who'd never had to try, because of the hands. Because of the way he'd asked, twice, whether it hurt, and actually waited for the answer both times, which was more attention than Grant had paid to any part of my body in the better part of a year. Grant cleared his throat, in the specific way men do when they've noticed another man's hands on their fiancé and are trying to decide whether that's a hill worth dying on in front of 40 coworkers. "I've got him," he said, moving to help me up. As Grant walked me down the hall to my room, I felt eyes on my back the entire way, not suspicious eyes, not yet, just watchful ones. And when I glanced back once, West was still crouched where I'd left him, studying the floor where I'd fallen with the particular unhurried attention of a man doing quiet math. He wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at the angle I'd landed at, like he was filing it somewhere for later. I didn't think much of it that night. I would come to regret that. In the mild, pleasant way you regret underestimating someone who turns out to be smarter than you gave them credit for. Back in my room, lying on top of the covers with my very fake ankle propped up on a pillow it did not need, I allowed myself exactly 5 minutes of feeling sorry for myself. For the version of me who'd once lain in a much colder bed of snow instead. Before I did what any sensible, mildly lazy person does after a full day of emotional labor. I fell promptly and shamelessly asleep, still in my jeans, one shoe on, and did not so much as dream. They put me in a first-floor room, ostensibly so I wouldn't have to manage stairs, which meant I missed the awkward hallway conversation Grant clearly wanted to have and did not get. I heard him outside my door for a moment, pacing on the phone, low voice, and when I finally drifted into something like sleep, I dreamed, for the first time in a year, about snow that didn't kill me. I woke at 6 a.m. to the sound of 40 people in expensive fleece assembling in the lobby with the manic enthusiasm of people who'd paid a company retreat fee and intended to get their money's worth. I did not go down. I lay in bed, ankle elevated, on 2 pillows I did not need to elevate it on, and listened through the wall as the group filed out into a morning that was, even through glass, the specific flat, silent white of a sky about to do something it had no plans of announcing. I did not watch them leave. I couldn't. Even knowing with a certainty no living person should be allowed to carry, that Grant and Kyle would separate from the group in about 90 minutes, that a slide would come at 8:52 a.m., that Grant would walk away from it with a dislocated shoulder, and Kyle with 2 broken fingers and a deeply incriminating amount of shared body heat. I found I could not sit at that window and watch 40 of my coworkers walk toward a mountain like it was a movie I already knew the ending to. Instead, at 7:15, hungry and restless and unable to stand my own thoughts, I hobbled. Genuinely, this time, because I'd taped the ankle tightly the night before for authenticity and left it wrapped through a full night's sleep, which had stiffened the joint for real, an unplanned side effect that made the whole performance even more convincing than I'd budgeted for, down to the lodge's small kitchen, where I found exactly one other person who hadn't gone on the hike. West was sitting at the counter with a mug of coffee he wasn't drinking, staring at the window with the same flat white sky I'd been avoiding, wearing an expression I recognized immediately, because I'd been wearing it myself for the last 12 hours. "You're not hiking either," I said. He looked up, and something in his face resolved, softened, like he'd been braced for someone else. "Not today, safety consultant who skips the safety hike. Bold strategy." "I flagged the slope 2 days ago," he said it flatly. No drama in it, just a fact set down on the counter between us like a closed file. Elevated risk, wind-loaded lee slope, temperature swing overnight. I told the organizers it should be postponed, and they didn't postpone it. They rebranded it as optional and put it back on the schedule an hour later. His jaw tightened, just slightly, the only sign that this bothered him more than his voice let on. There's a version of my job where I say something loud enough to actually stop it, and a version where I say it exactly loud enough to keep my consulting contract. I hate that I know which one I picked. I sat down next to him, easing my weight carefully onto the stool like a man protecting a truly injured ankle, and found, to my own surprise, that I believed him completely. Not the safety consultant cover story, which I still had no reason to trust, but the guilt. That part was real. I'd spent 4 years in an ER learning to read the difference between a person performing concern and a person actually carrying it, and his was the second kind, heavy and specific, the kind that comes from experience rather than policy training. "Have you seen an avalanche before?" I asked, gently. The way you ask a patient a question you already suspect the answer to. He was quiet long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "My older brother, backcountry trip, 6 years ago. I wasn't there. I was supposed to be there." He turned the coffee mug a quarter turn on the counter, a small contained gesture, like a man giving his hands something to do so they wouldn't do anything else. "I do this job now because I got very good, very fast, at reading conditions nobody wants to hear about. Doesn't help much if nobody listens." I thought about my own ankle, bandaged for a lie built on top of a memory nobody would ever believe. I thought about how strange it was, sitting in a kitchen with a stranger, that the 2 most honest conversations I'd had in this life, and the one before it, were both about a mountain neither of us was currently standing on. "I believe you," I said, "for what it's worth." He looked at me, really looked, the kind of look that takes an inventory, weighs something, files it, and something in his shoulders came down half an inch. Most people don't when I bring it up. They think I'm being dramatic for a consulting fee. I'm a nurse, I said. I catch people minimizing symptoms for a living. You're not doing that. If anything, you're underselling it. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one warming back up. That's either very reassuring or very concerning, coming from someone who was doing an award-worthy impression of a bad sprain last night and is now sitting here like it never happened. I froze for exactly 1 beat too long. You noticed I'm not limping. I noticed you walked from the door to that stool without favoring the ankle once, he said, and entirely mild about it, like he was reading me a weather report and not quietly dismantling my entire cover story. And that when Grant walked you off last night, you looked back at me, instead of at the floor you'd supposedly just tripped over. People who actually hurt themselves tend to keep checking the thing that hurts. You checked the room instead. I opened my mouth to argue and found, humiliatingly, that I had nothing. Occupational habit, I tried anyway. I diagnose everyone. Doesn't mean I follow my own advice. He didn't push it, which I noted, filed away, added to the small and growing folder in my head labeled West, things I like about. Instead, he slid the coffee toward me, untouched, still warm, like a man who'd decided wordlessly that I needed it more than he did. Drink that, he said. You look like you didn't sleep, neither did you. No, he agreed. I didn't. Outside, the flat white sky had started, very quietly, to let a little snow down, the kind that looks harmless from a warm kitchen, and means something else entirely 11,000 feet up a lee slope. I wrapped both hands around the mug he'd given me and did not look at the window again. For what it's worth, West said after a while, when the silence between us had stretched into something companionable instead of awkward, I don't actually think you're lying about the ankle out of nowhere. I think you're the kind of person who does something drastic rather than sit around watching a bad outcome happen in slow motion. That's not a criticism, if you're bracing for one. I recognize the type. I employ several of them. Is that your professional read or your personal one? Both, he said, without hesitation. I don't really believe in keeping the two separate. Life's too short to only be honest during business hours. I thought about Grant, who had never once, in 2 years, said anything that direct to me without an agenda quietly humming underneath it, and felt something in my chest loosen half a notch, the way a joint does right before it stops hurting. That's a dangerous thing to say to someone who's currently lying to your face about a sprained ankle. I can live dangerously, West said, and reached over to refill my mug from the pot on the counter without asking, which I noted, filed, again, in the folder, as exactly the kind of small, unglamorous kindness that had never once occurred to Grant to offer. It happened at 8:52, exactly the way I remembered it, and I want to say that knowing didn't make it easier, but that would be a lie of a different kind. We heard it before the radios did, a distant crack, flattened and rolled by distance into something almost gentle, the sound of a piece of the world deciding to move. West was on his feet before I'd even processed what I was hearing, already crossing to the window, already scanning the tree line with the specific, terrible focus of a man who has heard that sound exactly once before and has spent 6 years hoping never to hear it again. Then the lodge radio at the front desk crackled to life, and a voice that was trying very hard to sound calm and mostly succeeding said the words possible slide, Group 2, requesting SAR, and the entire morning turned into something with edges. Whatever had happened out there, it hadn't happened twice. In the life I remembered, the first slide had been followed by a smaller second one that finished the job on my leg. This time, whether because the timing had shifted by even a few minutes, or because, I told myself, because it let me breathe, the mountain simply didn't owe anyone a repeat performance, the radio traffic stayed steady at one slide, one location, injuries unknown. I decided not to examine too closely why that felt like the first lucky thing that had happened to me in either lifetime. West was on the phone to the county search and rescue coordinator inside 90 seconds, giving coordinates and slope data from memory, in a voice that had gone completely, professionally level, the panic folded somewhere out of sight where it could be useful later instead of now. I grabbed the lodge's first aid kit off the wall and said, "I'm coming." West looked at my ankle, then at my face, and made the fastest, most accurate assessment anyone had made of me in either of my lives. "You're not actually hurt," he said. "Not a question." "No," I said. "I'm really not." He didn't ask why. There wasn't time, and something in his expression told me he'd already decided it didn't matter, that whatever reason a person had for lying about an injury the night before an avalanche, it wasn't going to stop him from letting that person help carry a stretcher now. "Then move fast and try not to make me explain this to the county medic," he said, and we went. The rest of the morning existed for me the way trauma shifts always do, in fragments, sharp-edged and out of order, stitched together afterward into something like a story. The tree line, white and eerily silent. The county SAR team's dog catching a scent 40 yards off the marked trail, at almost exactly the coordinates I remembered from a life that technically hadn't happened this time. Kyle Bennett pulled out first, conscious, 2 fingers bent at an angle fingers shouldn't bend, saying Grant's name before he said anything else, before he thought to ask about anyone else in his own hiking group, which told the entire clearing everything it needed to know in about 4 seconds flat. And then Grant. Shoulder dislocated, face gray with cold and shock, blinking up at the ring of faces around him, his coworkers, his rescuers, and at the edge of it, holding a trauma kit he hadn't asked to be handed, his fiancé, who was supposed to be back at the lodge with a bad ankle. Daniel. His voice cracked on it. Whether from pain or something closer to guilt, I genuinely couldn't say, and for the first time in either version of this story, I found I didn't especially care to find out. "Don't talk," I said, professional, flat, already checking his shoulder with hands that didn't shake. Because whatever I felt about this man could wait its turn behind whatever the human body currently needed from me. Somewhere behind me I heard someone mutter, "Wait, I thought Daniel's ankle was," and I made a mental note to have a very convincing explanation ready by lunch, filed it under problems for later, and kept working. Behind me, close enough that I could feel the low, warm presence of him without turning around, West was directing 2 SAR volunteers toward the Overlook Trail. Toward the exact off-path route Grant and Kyle had taken, I realized and understood with a strange lurch that West had clocked the footprints, clocked the story they told, and clocked it fast enough to know precisely who had wandered off the marked trail and why, all without a single word of it needing to be said out loud in front of 40 stunned coworkers standing in the snow. He caught my eye once, over Grant's shoulder, while I worked. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. It was the look of a man silently handing someone else's secret back to them, unopened, and letting them decide, on their own time, what to do with it. By the time the SAR team had both men stabilized, and the makeshift triage line at the tree edge had thinned to a manageable trickle, my hands had gone from steady out of necessity to steady, because the adrenaline hadn't caught up yet, which I recognized, professionally, as the exact window in which competent people make their first mistake of the day. I sat down hard in the snow the second nobody needed me anymore, and West appeared at my elbow within seconds, wordlessly, with a thermal blanket and an expression that dared me to argue about needing it. I did not argue. Even a lazy man knows when to take the blanket. Nobody died. I want to say that clearly, because I know exactly how these stories can go, and I have no interest in writing a version of this where anyone's tragedy becomes someone else's punishment. Grant walked away with a dislocated shoulder and a hairline fracture in his collarbone. Kyle walked away with 2 broken fingers and a very long, very cold hour to think about his choices. Everyone else in the hiking group made it back with nothing worse than frostnip and a story they'd tell at Thanksgiving for the next decade. What got buried instead was a lie, and it came up for air faster than the snow ever did. It turned out Priya from Events, the same woman who'd been first to my side the night before, had also been about 20 feet behind Grant and Kyle when they peeled off the marked trail toward the Overlook, and had, in the specific petty heroism of a woman who'd once caught her own ex cheating and never forgiven the universe for letting him get away with it, taken exactly 1 photo on her phone before the visibility dropped. 2 men, hand in hand, 40 feet off trail, in a spot that had absolutely nothing to do with the scenic viewpoint the itinerary claimed they were headed toward. She didn't send it to me. She sent it, magnificently unprompted, to the entire company Slack channel, captioned only, "Glad everyone's safe. Also, does anyone know why G and K were all the way out past the ridge marker? Just wondering for safety reasons." I did not have to say a single word. I got to sit in the lodge's great room that evening, ankle elevated, mug of tea in hand, and watch an entire company of 40 people quietly, collectively, do the math in real time, while Grant sat across the room with his arm in a sling and the exact expression of a man who has just watched a controlled demolition of his own making. He came to find me later, once the room had thinned out. Sat down across from me with the careful, over-apologetic posture of a man rehearsing a speech he hadn't finished writing. "Daniel, I can explain." "You don't have to," I said it gently. Not cold. There's a version of this story where the ex gets a scene of righteous fury, and I understand the appeal, but that's not the story I was interested in living twice. I just felt, mostly, tired, and a little bit like a man setting down a bag he'd been carrying for 2 years without realizing how heavy it had gotten. I already know. His face did something complicated. How long? Long enough, I said, which was true in a way he couldn't possibly understand, and left it there. We didn't scream at each other. There was no thrown ring, no dramatic exit into the snow. Just two people admitting, quietly, that the thing they'd built had already been over for a while, and that the mountain had simply made it official in front of witnesses. "For what it's worth," Grant said, standing to leave, sling shifting awkwardly against his chest. "You deserved better than how this went." "I know," I said, not unkindly, because it was simply true, and truths don't have to be delivered with any particular heat to land. He nodded, like he'd expected exactly that answer, and had, on some level, been hoping for it, and left me alone with my tea in a room that felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely mine. The Slack fallout, as it turned out, had a much longer half-life than I expected. By Monday, the photo had made it into 3 separate group chats I wasn't even in, according to Priya, who reported this to me with the breathless delight of a war correspondent. By Wednesday, someone in marketing had quietly moved Kyle's desk to a different floor for workflow reasons. By the following Friday, Grant had been pulled into a meeting with HR that was technically about the retreat's incident report, and unofficially about exactly what 40 people had already worked out for themselves. I heard about all of it secondhand, from a safe and increasingly pleasant distance, the way you hear about weather in a city you used to live in. The best part, honestly, was how little effort any of it required from me. I hadn't confronted anyone, hadn't staged a single scene, hadn't spent 1 calorie of energy on revenge I didn't strictly have to spend. Priya's photo had done the confronting, the Slack channel had done the staging, the mountain, the timeline, and 40 coworkers with functioning eyesight had done the rest, and all I'd had to do was fake 1 convincing ankle and then get out of the way. If there is a more efficient form of justice available to a tired nurse, I have yet to discover it, and I am, on principle, not going looking. West found me on the porch an hour after the room had thinned, wrapped in a blanket someone from the lodge had pressed on me, watching a sky that had finally gone dark and clear and full of more stars than a city person had any business seeing. "Heard congratulations are in order," he said, easing into the chair beside mine. "On not getting engaged anymore, I mean. I assume that's a win from the smell of it. That obvious?" "You've had the specific look of a man who just got off a very long shift." He handed me a second mug of tea. He seemed, I was noticing, to have an instinct for showing up with exactly the right thing in his hands, and settled back, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, careful enough that they didn't quite. For what it's worth, the fake ankle held up beautifully. Very convincing performance, right up until the part where you sprinted across a snowfield to a stretcher. Thank you. I workshopped it. On who? On myself, mostly. I looked out at the mountain, black and enormous against the stars, the same mountain that had killed me once and, in this life, had somehow ended up saving me instead. It's a long story. I've got a coffee I'm not planning on finishing, West said, and apparently nowhere else to be. I looked at him, the flannel, the steady hands, the 6-year-old grief he'd folded into competence instead of letting it curdle, and thought, with a clarity that had nothing to do with rebirth and everything to do with simply finally paying attention, that I might, for the first time in either version of my life, actually want to tell somebody the whole story and see what they did with it. "Okay," I said, "but you have to promise not to have me committed." "Low bar," he said. "I work in avalanche risk. I've heard worse things believed with more confidence," so I told him. "Not all of it, not that first night. Some things a person has to earn, but enough. Enough that by the time the tea went cold in both our hands, and the stars had wheeled a visible quarter turn overhead, West Hale knew that I had, somehow, in some way neither of us could explain, seen this exact weekend before, and had spent it trying to keep as many people as possible from paying for a mistake that wasn't theirs to pay for. He didn't laugh. He didn't look at me like I'd finally cracked under grief. He sat with it, turned it over the way he turned over avalanche data, and said finally, well, that would explain the ankle, and the flagstone, and why you looked back at me instead of the floor. You noticed that too? I notice a lot of things, West said, and there was something in the way he said it, warm, low, unhurried, aimed directly at me and not at the mountain for once. That made the whole cold porch feel about 10 degrees warmer than it had any right to. It took me 4 days to find out West Hale was not, in fact, a safety consultant contracted by the hour. I found out the way that most people in Jackson Hole eventually find out anything. Through Priya, who'd taken to texting me updates as though I were a beloved but distant relative of the company's ongoing gossip cycle, ever since the Great Slack photo incident had made me, unfairly, into something of a local legend. Beady way, she texted, 4 days after the retreat, alongside a screenshot of the Ridgeline Outfitters About Leadership page. Did you know Weston is Ridgeline? Like his family literally started the company. He does safety audits as some kind of penance thing after his brother died. Nobody's supposed to make a big deal of it. Don't tell him I told you. I stared at the photo for a long moment. West, in a suit that fit him with the specific ease of a man who owned several, standing under a company banner, the words Weston Hale, Chief Executive Officer, beneath the face I had, 4 nights ago, watched go soft and unguarded over a mug of cold tea. I called him. He picked up on the second ring, which felt, in retrospect, like a small and telling thing. You're the CEO, I said, by way of greeting. A pause, then, with the specific caution of a man bracing for a very particular kind of reaction. Technically, mostly I try not to be, if I can help it. You let me think you were, what, a contractor with a clipboard. I let you think what everyone at that retreat thought, West said, because it was the only version of that weekend where I got to have a normal conversation with someone instead of a business one. You told me the truest thing anyone's told me in years, on a porch, over bad tea, because you thought I was just a guy with an ankle theory. I wasn't going to ruin that by handing you a business card. I sat with that for a second, the specific, quiet loneliness of a man rich and important enough that half the honesty in his life had gotten filtered out by his own title, and felt something in my chest do a slow, unfamiliar thing, something that had absolutely nothing to do with a mountain or a lie or a fiancé I no longer had. For the record, I said, I liked you better as the guy with the ankle theory. Good, West said, and I could hear, even over the phone, the smile in it, because he's still in here somewhere. Turns out he'd very much like to take you to dinner. As himself. Suit optional. Is this the part where a mysterious wealthy man tries to buy my affection with an expensive restaurant? This is the part. West said, where a man who has spent 6 years mostly talking to spreadsheets and avalanche reports would like to take the first interesting person he's met in longer than he cares to admit somewhere with decent lighting, so he can look at him properly. The restaurant's optional too. I hear Diner Pancakes hold up fine as a location for that. I laughed, really laughed, the good kind, the kind I hadn't let myself have much of in either version of this year. Pancakes, I said. Saturday. But you're paying, Mr. CEO. Wouldn't dream of doing anything else, Wes said, and something about the warmth in his voice, easy and certain and entirely unbothered by titles, made me think that whatever this second chance of mine had actually been for, it might not have been about the avalanche at all. I hung up the phone and sat on my bed for a long moment, laughing quietly at absolutely nothing, or possibly everything. A company CEO with an ankle theory, a fiancé imploding on a company Slack channel 2 states away in real time, and me, 13 months into a life I was apparently not going to waste this time around. It occurred to me, not for the first time, that the universe had a truly bizarre sense of humor. It had also, for once, put the joke on the right people. The diner West took me to was, gratifyingly, exactly as unglamorous as promised, vinyl booths, a laminated menu with a photo of every dish taken sometime in the previous decade, a waitress named Dot who called him Han, without a hint of recognizing she was talking to the head of a 9-figure outdoor gear company. He ordered the same thing I did. He also, I noted, tipped Dot an amount that made her visibly reconsider her entire relationship to laminated menus. So, I said, once the pancakes had arrived, stacked with the kind of confidence only diner syrup can provide. "Tell me about your brother." He didn't flinch, which I took as a good sign, that the offer to talk about it wasn't the kind of landmine question a person needed careful handling to survive. "Marcus," West said. "Older by 4 years. He's the reason I got into this whole business, actually. Not the company, the risk side of it. He used to drag me backcountry skiing before I was old enough to know I should be scared of it." A small, real smile, the first grief-adjacent smile I'd ever seen someone actually pull off without it looking performed. He was better at reading snow than anyone I've ever met, which is the part that used to keep me up at night. If he couldn't see it coming, what business did I have thinking I could? "But you do it anyway." "I do it anyway," he agreed. "Badly, some weeks. Well, other weeks. The retreat wasn't one of my better weeks. I flagged the risk and let myself get talked out of pushing harder, and 40 people almost paid for that." He looked at me over the pancakes, steady, unflinching. "You didn't, though. You did something about it. Faked an entire ankle injury and lied to your own fiancé's face rather than let people walk into something you somehow already knew was coming. I've been thinking about that for 4 days. It wasn't heroic," I said. "Mostly it was just, I'd already lived through the version where I didn't do anything. I wasn't going to sit through the sequel, and honestly, faking an injury was a lot less effort than trying to talk 40 strangers out of a company-mandated hike. I know myself. I took the lazy option that also happened to work." "That's the most heroic definition of lazy I've ever heard," West said, and reached across the table, unhurried, to wipe a smear of syrup off the corner of my mouth with his thumb, an act so casually intimate that I nearly dropped my fork. "You could have just told me you were the CEO, I said, a little breathless, a little annoyed at how effective the syrup thing had been. "I could have," West agreed, entirely unbothered, retracting his hand at a pace that suggested he'd enjoyed the reaction more than he'd admit to. "But you looked like you needed the excuse to stop talking about avalanches for a second. We stayed at that diner for 3 hours. Dot refilled our coffee 4 times, and eventually stopped pretending she wasn't charmed by the whole thing. I learned that West Hale ran a company he'd never particularly wanted, kept every safety report his brother had ever filed in a drawer he opened more than he told anyone, and had, until 4 nights ago on a cold porch, genuinely believed the most honest conversation he was capable of having with another person was about slope angles and snowpack density. He learned that I'd once, in a life he now, somehow, entirely believed had happened, died in the snow with nobody coming, and had spent my one shot at a do-over mostly trying to make sure fewer people had to learn what that felt like. He also learned, with visible delight, that I would rather fake a compound injury in front of 40 coworkers than get up and walk 12 feet to my own refrigerator, a fact he filed away with the same careful attention he gave everything else about me. Somewhere around the second refill of coffee, Dot asked, entirely without malice, whether we were the two from the news thing up at the lodge, which neither of us had realized had actually made local news, a brief, dry item about a company retreat and a slide with no fatalities, the kind of story that runs once and is forgotten by dinner. West handled it with the easy, practiced deflection of a man used to being recognized for reasons he didn't enjoy, and I found myself, oddly, wanting to protect that same privacy for him, even this early, even before I had any real claim to it. "For what it's worth," he said, as we finally stood to leave, snow falling soft and harmless outside the diner window, nothing like the kind that had nearly ended 2 lives days earlier. "I think whatever sent you back did a pretty good job. Nobody died. The right people got embarrassed, and I got pancakes with the only person who's ever made me feel like I could put the spreadsheets down for an afternoon." "Careful," I said. "I might start thinking you like me." "Daniel," West said, low and certain, close enough now that I could feel the warmth of him through the space between us. "I think I've liked you since you tried to convince a room full of 40 people that a step you knew perfectly well was uneven had somehow ambushed you. It was a good performance." "It was a great performance," he said, and kissed me, soft, unhurried, tasting faintly of diner syrup and 6 years of a carefulness that seemed, right there in the snow-lit parking lot, to finally be setting itself down. We stood there long enough that Dot eventually rapped on the diner window, with her knuckle and mouthed, unbothered, close in 5, "Han," which broke the moment in the exact gentle ordinary way that told me this. Whatever this was starting to be, was going to be built out of pancakes and parking lots and small interruptions, and not out of mountains at all. I found, walking back to the car with West's hand loosely wrapped around mine, that I liked that version considerably better. What followed was, by the standards of either of my lives, almost embarrassingly gentle. We took it slow, in the specific way two people do when they've both, in their own ways, learned exactly how fast the ground can disappear out from under a person. West drove up from the Ridgeline headquarters in Jackson most weekends, always with something small and unnecessary in hand. A thermos of good coffee, a paperback he thought I'd like, once, memorably, an actual physical avalanche safety pamphlet with a note stuck to the front that read for professional purposes only, obviously, which made me laugh so hard I had to sit down. He came to the ER once, in early spring, not for himself, but because he'd heard through the diner waitress grapevine that had somehow, impossibly, extended all the way to hospital gossip, that I'd pulled a triple shift during a bad flu outbreak and hadn't eaten anything that didn't come from a vending machine in 2 days. He showed up at the nurse's station at 11 p.m. with takeout from the good Thai place, no fanfare, no expectation of a scene, and simply set it on the counter and said, "Eat, I'll wait." My coworkers have not, to this day, let me live down the sheer volume of my colleagues who suddenly developed an urgent need to walk past the nurse's station that night. There was an adjustment period, if I'm honest. Not to West, who made himself easy to adjust to, but to the sheer novelty of being with someone who didn't require managing. 2 years with Grant had trained me, without my quite noticing, to keep a running mental account of his moods, his ego, the small diplomatic maneuvers required to keep an evening pleasant. It took me an embarrassingly long time to realize I didn't need to do that with West, that he simply said what he meant, expected the same from me, and left the rest alone. The first time I caught myself mid-sentence, quietly softening a complaint the way I used to for Grant, and then stopped, and just said the actual thing, West's only response was a small, pleased nod, like he'd been waiting for me to notice I was allowed to. He was, it turned out, exactly the person the porch conversation had promised. Steady where Grant had been showy, quietly attentive in a way that never once needed an audience to matter. He remembered which coffee order was mine after hearing it exactly once. He learned, without being told, that I hated being fussed over when I was actually sick, but loved being fussed over when I was merely tired, and calibrated accordingly with an accuracy that would have unsettled me if it hadn't felt, instead, like being finally, thoroughly known. He also, without a shred of judgment, started leaving pre-made meals in my fridge on the weekends he wasn't around, having correctly diagnosed within a month that my own cooking effort maxed out at cereal defiantly for dinner. There were funny disasters too, because no love story worth telling is only soft lighting and diner syrup. In late April, West tried to cook me dinner to prove he could, and set off the smoke alarm in his own kitchen so dramatically that his very expensive, very modern home security system, called the fire department, who arrived to find the CEO of Ridgeline Outfitters standing in a haze of smoke, holding a single catastrophically burnt salmon fillet like a man defending his honor. I did not let him live it down for a full month. The second disaster came weeks later, in a completely different key. I'd promised to teach him a proper suture knot, his idea, after he'd watched me practice on an orange at the kitchen table one night and gotten unreasonably invested, and we'd used a kitchen towel as a stand-in for skin. I got overconfident somewhere around the third pass and ended up, through a sequence of events neither of us could fully reconstruct afterward, tying his own wrist securely to the drawer handle. "You're supposed to be good at this," he said, laughing, wrist very much bound to the drawer. "I'm good at it on people who aren't actively laughing at me," I said, which only made him laugh harder, which only made the knot worse, which is how we ended up, 20 minutes later, both of us on the kitchen floor, breathless with the specific, ridiculous joy of 2 grown adults who have accidentally handcuffed themselves to a drawer with dish towels, and cannot, for the life of them, stop finding it funny. It took a full 25 minutes, and eventually a butter knife, to free him, during which time West informed me, with great solemnity, that he was drafting a formal company memo recommending I never again be allowed near rope, towels, or anything with a knot in it without direct supervision. I told him that was rich, coming from a man whose own kitchen had a standing relationship with the fire department. He conceded the point. We ordered takeout instead, on the floor, still laughing, which is how most of our best nights that year ended up going. Not with grand gestures, but with small disasters neither of us particularly minded cleaning up. Grant, for the record, transferred to Ridgeline's Denver office 3 months after the retreat, ostensibly for a promotion, actually because, Priya reported gleefully, via a Slack screenshot I did not ask for but did not decline reading either. Kyle Bennett had, in the fullness of time and 2 broken fingers, decided he'd rather date literally anyone else, and the 2 of them could no longer occupy the same building without the entire marketing department developing a nervous tic. I felt, when I heard it, less satisfaction than I expected, and more of a distant, kind indifference, the way you feel about weather in a city you no longer live in. By early summer, West had stopped driving up on weekends and started, quietly, simply living there. A toothbrush that appeared and never left, a drawer that filled itself with his shirts without either of us ever formally discussing it, a habit of falling asleep with one hand loosely curled around my wrist like a man checking, even unconscious, that the pulse under his fingers was steady. I said, one night, early June, both of us tangled together on the porch swing he'd bought for my apartment, despite the apartment not really having room for a porch swing, watching the Tetons go gold and then gray in the last of the light. In my other life, I died on that mountain, thinking nobody would ever come looking for me. I would have come looking, West said, quiet, certain, his thumb tracing slow circles against the inside of my wrist. I didn't know you yet. I would have come anyway. That's a very confident thing to say about a version of you that never met me. I've read a lot of avalanche reports, he said. I know exactly how far a person will go if it's the right person under the snow. I turned my head against his shoulder, breathing in cedar and coffee, and something that had, somewhere in the last 4 months, quietly become the smell of home instead of the smell of a hallway I'd once faked an injury in. There had been 100 small signs building toward that night, none of them dramatic on their own. The toothbrush, the shirts in the drawer, the way Bandage had started sleeping at the foot of the bed on West's side instead of mine, as if even the dog had quietly recalculated whose lap was the better long-term investment. I hadn't planned to say anything that particular evening. I rarely plan anything I actually mean. It tends to come out sideways, mid-sentence, before the more careful, more anxious part of my brain can talk me out of it. Marry me, I said, before I'd entirely decided to say it, and then, because apparently rebirth had done nothing whatsoever to improve my sense of timing, added, sorry. That was supposed to be more of a question. West went very still for a second. Then he laughed, the full, unguarded laugh I'd only ever gotten out of him 3 or 4 times, the one that made him look about a decade younger and infinitely less like a man who owned a company. You faked a sprained ankle to avoid a mountain, he said, and now you're proposing to me over a porch swing with 0 warning. I have never once, in either of our lives, met anyone less predictable than you. Is that a yes, Daniel? He tipped my chin up with 2 fingers, the same gentle, deliberate touch he'd used on my ankle the very first night, 4 months and 1 whole life ago, and kissed me slow and thorough and utterly certain. That was a yes before you finished the sentence. We got married the following spring, in a backyard in Jackson Hole with exactly 42 guests, a suspicious number of whom worked in emergency medicine and had, at some point during the reception, tried to teach each other suture knots using the napkins, which West found so relentlessly funny that he made me retell the story of the dish towel incident to at least 6 separate relatives. We did not have kids, and we didn't plan to, just the 2 of us, one very spoiled rescue dog named Bandage, my choice, obviously, and a life that had, somewhere along the way, become so ordinary and so good that I sometimes had to remind myself it was the version I'd nearly not gotten at all. West still runs Ridgeline, though these days with a safety department that answers to nobody but him and a standing company policy, quietly instituted the year we got engaged, that no optional hike happens without an actual, enforceable veto power sitting with whoever's reading the snowpack that morning. He still keeps his brother's old field reports in a drawer he opens more than he tells anyone. Some Sundays I find him at the kitchen table with them spread out, coffee gone cold, and I don't say anything. I just put a hand on his shoulder and let him have the quiet, the way you'd hold space for anyone processing a grief that's finally found somewhere safe to sit. He still cannot, under any circumstances, be trusted alone with a stove. This is a scientifically established fact in our household, backed by 3 separate smoke alarm incidents and 1 memorable visit from the Jackson Hole Fire Department, who now recognize our address on site and, I am fairly sure, have taken bets on how long it'll be before they're back. I, for my part, remain constitutionally incapable of using our dishwasher for anything but storage, a fact West has stopped trying to correct and started simply working around, which I consider one of the more romantic things anyone has ever done for me. Priya, who still texts me at least once a month with unsolicited Ridgeline gossip, insists this counts as true love, actually, and I have stopped arguing with her, mostly because she's not wrong. I still work the ER, though fewer doubles these days, because West has an uncanny ability to materialize at the nurse's station at exactly the moment I've hit hour 10 of a shift, holding takeout and looking entirely unbothered by the fact that half my coworkers now refer to him, affectionately, as Daniel's emotional support billionaire. And some nights, when the light goes gold over the mountains, the exact way it did the summer he asked me. The summer I asked him, if we're being accurate about who did the actual asking. I still think about the man who faked a sprained ankle in a hallway with 1 uneven flagstone step, lying to an entire room of strangers to buy himself 1 more chance at a life he'd already lost once. I think about how strange it is that the biggest lie I ever told turned out to be the truest thing I ever did. I think, too, about how little any of it actually cost me. I didn't fight a mountain. I didn't fight Grant, not really. I lay down, faked an injury, drank some tea, and let the truth do the heavy lifting on its own schedule, which is, I maintain, exactly the kind of plan a chronically lazy, thoroughly competent nurse should be proud of. If there's a moral in any of this, it's a modest one. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do with a second chance isn't to fight harder. It's to get out of the way and let gravity do what gravity was always going to do anyway. West found me on the porch last week, mid-June, bandage asleep in a patch of sun between us, and asked, apropos of nothing, whether I ever missed it. The drama of it, the mountain, the version of my life that had so much riding on a single hallway step. No, I said, and meant it completely, tucking myself into the warm, steady curve of him, the way I'd been doing, happily, for over a year now. I got the good ending. I'm not going back for a rewrite. Good, West said, pressing a kiss into my hair, unhurried, certain, the way he'd been certain of me since a cold porch and 2 mugs of forgotten tea. Because I already told you, if you'd gone under that snow, I would have come looking. I'm very glad I never had to. Bandage chose that exact moment to sigh, deeply and dramatically, in her sleep, as if she too had opinions about how sentimental we were both being on a Tuesday. West laughed, the real kind, and I decided, watching the last of the gold light slide off the mountains, that I was in no particular hurry for the evening to end. Outside, the Tetons stood exactly where they always had, enormous, silent, capable of terrible things, and for the first time in either of my lives, I looked at them and felt, instead of dread, something closer to gratitude. Some mountains take. That one, in the end, only ever gave me back to myself. Every February now, around the anniversary of that retreat, West and I do the same small, slightly absurd ritual. We drive up to the lodge, order 2 hot toddies we don't finish, and I make him walk the hallway with the uneven flagstone step so I can point at it like a tour guide. This, I tell him, every year with the same theatrical solemnity, is where I gave the performance of a lifetime. He always says the same thing back, that he's read a lot of incident reports in his career, and mine remains, to this day, the only one that ended in a wedding. Dot still works the diner down the road, still calls him Han, still refuses, on principle, to charge us for the first round of coffee, no matter how many times we insist. Some things, it turns out, are worth keeping exactly the way they were the first time you found them, snow and all. If Daniel and West's story kept you warm through a mountain full of drama, hit follow for the next one. New chapters drop every week, and the next rebirth romance is already headed for a plot twist of its own.